Okay, good evening everybody. Welcome to the LMI for this meeting. It's fantastic to be able to introduce a friend and colleague, Susan Jebb, who is now, Professor Susan Jebb, who's now currently chair of the Food Standards Agency. Susan and I have worked together on and off for 20 plus years on various aspects of obesity, which is of course my own interest, although Susan is not going to talk about obesity today. She's going to focus mostly on the work of the Food Standards Agency. I should add that as well as being chair of the Food Standards Agency, she's also a professor of nutrition and dietetics at the University of Oxford, so she has an academic position as well. How she manages all of those things, I don't know. She's a remarkable person, but I'm sure we're going to have a really interesting lecture this evening. Susan, you're going to tell us all about the work of Food Standards.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and one of the ways that I manage it is by not doing very much socialising. So occasions like this, which actually feel like rather a nice evening, are a great treat. And it's lovely to be back at the LMI. I've spoken here a couple of times, probably mostly when John has been organising courses and events, and that has always been around obesity. So when he invited me to come again, I thought, oh, that's an easy one, churn out another obesity talk. And he said, oh no, we'd really like you to talk about the Food Standards Agency. And it's a really interesting opportunity for me to do it, because I've been chair of the FSA for about 18 months now. And it certainly took me a good 6 months to really understand what it did. And when I applied for the job, I thought I knew what the FSA was all about. I very quickly realised I only knew the sort of tip of the iceberg. And I guess what I want to try to do this evening is to sort of just introduce you to some of the work the FSA does, because at the end of the day, it is there to protect public health. That's our job, it's our statutory responsibility. And so anyway, I want to give you just a little flavour of what that half of my life involves. So the FSA, I should start off by saying, is a non-ministerial government department. Now, what that means is, although the name is a bit deceptive in saying agency, we're not an arm's length body, we're not a quango, we're not like the Environment Agency, which is basically an offshoot of DEFRA. We're an actual government department. But the non-ministerial bit means that we don't have a minister. Instead, there's a chair and a board. And so we are responsible for the work that the agency do. But we report directly into Parliament. We get our own funding direct from the Treasury. And that gives us an extraordinarily privileged position, because we have a very high level of independence. And that is how it was designed to be. So the FSA was set up, as some of you I know remember, because we've been talking about it over drinks, was set up in 2000 in the wake of the BSE crisis. And it was set up with a statutory responsibility to protect public health and the wider interests of consumers in relation to food. It was there to be the consumer champion within government, because it was perceived in the wake of BSE that ministers were perhaps not always making decisions which were wholly in the public interest. They were making them for other reasons as well. It's funny how over time, many people actually have forgotten just how serious the BSE crisis was. In the end, the number of deaths that were attributable to BSE was in the hundreds, but that was a lot lower than was feared at the very start of the epidemic. It could have been very much worse. But of course, the risk and the uncertainty of that cost industry very dearly indeed. And the cost to the economy was estimated at about £3.5 billion. It's worth remembering that it was only last year that we were able to start exporting our lamb back to the USA. And that was a relic from BSE. So trust in food is hard won and very, very easily lost. And that's something that we in the FSA really remind ourselves of all the time. The other feature of FSA is that it has this rather complicated structure. So we operate in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and we work very closely with Food Standards Scotland, who, and we try to work together, very committed to a One UK approach, unless there are particular reasons why countries might do things differently. But the complicating factor is we have slightly different responsibilities in each of these countries. Notably, it's only in Northern Ireland where we're responsible for nutrition standards, but not in England, where that's been with the Department of Health since 2011, and a bit more on that later. But that multiple country working is also another reason why our independence and our political independence is so important, because we have to advise ministers in each of those countries, and at the moment they have quite different views. So actually having a body like FSA, which can be very science and evidence led, I think is incredibly important. So here we go. Our mission, what we're all about, is food you can trust, and we do that through 3 specific objectives: that food is safe, that it is what it says it is, and that food's healthier and more sustainable. And we added that last one when we refreshed our strategy last year, in fact just about this time last year. And that was really something that those of you who know me will imagine I drove very hard, that we should add in that healthier and more sustainable element. Because it seemed to me it was ridiculous having a government department whose only job was to focus on food. We put food first, second, third, fourth and fifth on our priority list. And it seemed to me we should be doing more than just food safety. Now, policy-making responsibilities for health lie with DH, with sustainability predominantly lie with DEFRA. But what I think FSA can do is to provide a joining up between those departments, because we can't have separate policies, one for food safety, one for food and health and one for sustainability. We've got to have some joined up holistic policy. And I hope that FSA can play its part in helping to bring that all together. So as part of our strategy, we really tried to identify, well, what is it that the FSA do in principle? And there are really 5 ways that we work. The first and most important is that we are an evidence generator, and a lot of our staff are scientists. We do a lot of risk assessment around food safety. And we put that evidence into the public domain. So a feature of what we do is that we try to be very open and transparent. So all of our research is published on our website and elsewhere. We are a policymaker, and we are, of course, also the regulator in the food system. Another element that we're taking increasingly seriously is our job as a watchdog. Not a perfect word, but essentially we're there to look out for consumer interests in the food system. And just last year we published our first ever a report on food standards in the UK, which was basically a very objective look at the state of standards. And we did that because I think it's a moment in time, because so much is changing. People are a little bit concerned. Are food standards going up or down or staying the same? So we thought that we should start off what I hope will be an annual report, so we can see how things are changing over time. And finally, we're a convener and collaborator. And I think I perhaps explained that when I talked about us trying to join up interests across government and indeed across the food system outside of government. So this new strategy, I think, was particularly needed because our roles and responsibilities have changed enormously since leaving the EU. We're no longer just a sort of enforcer of rules. We're now actually making some of those rules. You'll perhaps have heard of the retained EU law bill, which is going through Parliament at the moment. This is basically a bill. Well, let me step back. When we left the EU, a lot of the laws were just transferred onto the UK statute. And government has decided that the time has come that we should get rid of all of those laws. And so they will be so-called sunsetted at the end of this year, unless we take specific action to rewrite them into UK law. Now, For the FSA, the idea that we could sunset the laws we're responsible for is, frankly, inconceivable. These are most of the basic protections that there are in food. They're the laws which say that meat has to be inspected to make sure it's fit for human consumption. It's the laws that say you have to declare ingredients on a packet. It's the laws which say what the limit of contaminants is in food. These are things which are absolutely fundamental to keeping food safe. And so we're going to be working very hard to try to get those onto the UK statute and, of course, to make sure they continue to work across the whole of the UK. One of the challenges we face is that when we were part of the EU, actually those food laws came from Europe, so automatically England, Scotland, Ireland, Northern Ireland and Wales, we were all doing the same thing. But now that we're outside the EU, there is the opportunity for each country to decide to do things differently. We don't think that would be generally in the interests of consumers, and so mostly we're trying to promote a one UK approach unless there's particular reasons why things should be done differently. So, for example, the rules on raw drinking milk are different in the different countries, which really hinges on the risk appetite that ministers have. So we allow it in England with specific controls, but in other parts of the UK, you may not be able to purchase raw drinking milk. Now, our responsibilities for UK food standards mean that we need to worry about food which is produced at home, but also the food that is imported. And about 40% or so of our food is imported. And traditionally, about 30% of that was from the EU. But that's changing really quite fast. So just in the period since we've left the EU, 8 countries have increased their imports to the UK by more than 50%. So we are getting our food from more diverse places. And of course, that exposes us to different types of risk than we've previously faced. As part of the new free trade agreements that government's negotiating, it's our job in the FSA to provide advice to ministers on whether those free trade agreements would uphold UK food standards. So we're busy doing that. And at the same time, we also have to provide reassurance to countries where we are exporting food that actually our standards have stayed as high as they were in the EU. So we have visitations from other countries and we have to prove to them with all the documentation that we're upholding our UK food standards. Tomorrow I'm going to be visiting the Port Health Authority here in Liverpool, and it's an important visit because ports are essentially the front line for our international food trade. And the regulatory system that we've had at the borders has been there for years and years and years. Since we left the EU, our government took the decision that we weren't going to impose import controls on food coming from the EU. But we're concerned that that actually leaves quite a risk, because countries now know that there are no import controls at the border, and we think that over time that risk might increase. However, we want to take the opportunity as we bring in import controls is actually to harmonise that with the rest of the world, rather than having one scheme which is for the EU and another for all the other countries. We think that the controls should be based on risk, and they should be intelligence-led. So we want to devise a system which allows the controls to be based on the type of product, because obviously some products are riskier than others, the country it's coming from, because some have better controls than others, the company, what's their history of compliance? Is this, if you like, a trusted trader, or is this, somebody we've never seen before? And not just do it rather crudely on the country of origin. So we're currently doing a lot of data-led work so that we can design a system for our import controls, which will mean that we check things that are the highest risk. We can't check everything, and we'd be looking for, a very sharp needle in a very large haystack. So we've got to be data and intelligence-led if we're going to do it in a proportionate way. Now, whilst it sometimes feels like sort of everything has changed since we left the EU, it also sometimes feels that nothing has changed at all. Sorry, it was my old slide. And at the heart of what we do continues to be protecting the public from foodborne illnesses. I was talking about this again just over drinks. Despite our very best efforts, the rates of foodborne illness seem to persist, and we are really struggling to get these any lower. There was a dip during the pandemic, went down by about 13%, but we think that was almost certainly because lots of food businesses shut, lots of hospitality closed, and people were eating out much less. And we know people are far, far less likely to report foodborne illnesses which happen at home than they do when they've eaten out. And sadly, we saw this decline during the pandemic, but as you can see in these figures, mostly seems to be bouncing back. Maybe we've had some change with salmonella. By the end of next month, we'll have the next year of data, and I have to say I'm not hugely optimistic that the salmonella one won't have picked up again either. So just to put this into sort of real numbers, what we would say in the agency is that 5 people every minute are made sick from eating contaminated food. That's 2.4 million foodborne disease-related cases which are notified each year. More than 15,000 people are admitted into hospital, and about 160 people die every year from a foodborne illness. These are all, in theory, preventable deaths. And aside from the human cost, of course, there's the pressure it adds to our health systems and the cost to the wider economy of people having time off work and so on, which is estimated to be about £10 billion a year. So the work we do in the agency really, really matters to keep these under control, and I just wish we could find ways of reducing them even further. As a scientist, of course, I think that we should be turning to science to help us out with this problem. And there are 2 big projects going on in the agency which I think are really quite groundbreaking, both at sort of different parts of science. The first is a project, it's a £90 million cross-government project, which is called PathSafe, which stands for Pathogen Surveillance in Agriculture, Food and the Environment. And essentially that's trying to understand at a very detailed level, using whole genome sequencing, how foodborne pathogens and antimicrobial resistance really moves between the environment, food and farms. So that's really trying to go back to basics and understand patterns of transmission. At the other end, we have a very behavioural project, which is called Kitchen Life. And that's essentially an ethnographic study of what people do in their kitchens. Because if we ask people about their food safety behaviours, they're very good at reporting that their fridge is at the perfect temperature, and of course they have different coloured chopping boards, and they'd never think of washing their chicken before they put it in the oven. Actually, quite a few things like that do happen when you go and look at people in their kitchens. So what we want to do is to really understand what is going on so that we tailor our advice and support for consumers to really work out where the risks lie in people's kitchens. Now, alongside food is safe, we're also very committed to food that is what it says it is. And these 2 issues really come together in the case of food hypersensitivity. So by that we mean the whole combination of food allergies, food intolerance, or any other adverse reactions to food. And around 2 million people in the UK report that they have some form of food hypersensitivity. Most commonly, that's a reaction to milk, often cereal, particularly gluten, but eggs, nuts are also big sources of food hypersensitivity in the UK. Over the last 20 years, hospital admissions for food allergies have actually gone up. It's hard to know whether that is that the prevalence is higher or whether the diagnosis is higher or people are more likely to go to hospital. But the good news is that fatalities are significantly down. And over the last 20 years, they've more than halved. But still, about 0.3% of people who are admitted to hospital, not even admitted to hospital, about 0.3% of people die from a food hypersensitivity. That's essentially about 7 people a year. Again, it's another potentially avoidable death. And these are very often, most commonly, these are young people. So 16 to 25-year-olds appear to be the group who are most at risk. And we can, speculate a number of reasons why that they may be particularly vulnerable. Very often these cases are very high profile. Many of you will have heard of or will remember the case of Natasha Ednam-Laperouse, who died after eating undeclared sesame seed in a sandwich when she was on an aeroplane. And we subsequently worked with her, with her family, with the allergy charities, with industry and government to really design some new legislation which required much better labelling of foods which are so-called pre-packed for direct sale. So allergens, of course, have been labelled on the food you buy in the supermarket for a long time, on packets. But until the end of last year, or the year before, 2021, when this law, so-called Natasha's Law, came in, food which was pre-packed for direct sale, so made in your sandwich shop and then wrapped and sold, didn't have to have that full ingredient labelling. Now it does, and very shortly we'll get the report from the evaluation about how the implementation of that law has gone. Sadly, Natasha's death was not an isolated case. Owen Carey died because a burger he purchased in a restaurant wasn't labelled as having been marinated in buttermilk, and he had a serious milk allergy. And more recently, we've had the coroner's report on the death of Celia Marsh from undeclared milk protein in a product which was labelled as a vegan wrap. And that's really thrown the spotlight on traceability through the food supply chain. These chains are really complicated. Ingredients come from multiple places, and we need to make sure that all of that information is passed through the food chain if we're going to keep people safe. We're currently working with businesses to raise awareness and try to improve the training they give for their staff. And that's a real challenge at the moment because, as you'll be well aware, the labour shortages, particularly in the food chain, mean that people are scared myself there. People are turning over very fast. You've often got young people coming into their first job who may just not have had sufficient training to be able to be as allergy aware as we need them to be. The other thing we're working very hard on is precautionary allergen labelling. So these are the notes you've all seen on the packet that says may contain nuts. And the problem with these is that nobody really knows what that means. So on the one hand, people with allergies are not really sure whether that means they really should avoid it because it really might contain nuts, or whether actually that's just the company sort of trying to protect themselves somehow. Whereas other people who don't have food allergies get very irritated when they buy a packet of cashew nuts and it says may contain nuts. And that sort of undermines people's whole confidence in the labelling. So we're doing some work to really try to improve that. Okay, enough on food allergies. Let me move on to what is really the heart of what we do, which is about checking on standards for both food hygiene and food authenticity. And so here we work in very close association with local authorities, with environmental health officers who check food hygiene, and with trading standards officers who check on food standards and authenticity. Now, across the country, there's slightly different scheme that runs in Scotland, but broadly, as you can see from this map, actually hygiene standards are pretty good around the country. Though, of course, we would still like them to be higher. Many of you will be familiar, I hope, with our FHRS food hygiene rating scheme, which is the score that is given by the environmental health officer to that business. And 5 is Great, that's good. But 5 is meeting every single bit of the law. It's not doing something super duper extra brilliantly wonderful. 5 is where all of them should be. And anything less than 5 is that there are some areas for improvement. Many of us, certainly I, pride myself when I see a 5 sticker on the door, and I think how clever and brilliant I am in having chosen so carefully to go to such a high-quality establishment. The problem is that you're not required to put these stickers up. And funnily enough, people who get 2s and 3s are a bit less keen on putting the sticker on the door. And so the problem is that most of us, me included, are not very good at checking before I go, what is the food hygiene rating? In the FSA, we would really like it to be mandatory that these have to be displayed. That's already the case in Wales. And when it was introduced in Wales, what we saw was a disproportionate increase in the number of businesses achieving 4 and 5 ratings compared to the change in England at the same time. I think showing that that mandatory requirement drives up food standards. The other thing we're doing in the absence of mandation is to try to work with influential players in the system. So one of the things I'm really proud of is we've been working with the delivery companies, so the Deliveroos and the Uber Eats of this world. And we've managed to get them to agree not to have businesses on their platform that score less than 3. I'd love it if it was less than 4, but still, that's really, really important. And it's become a real incentive for businesses to make sure they're up to an acceptable standard. The other thing we do, which is absolutely core to our business of keeping food safe, is what are called official controls. And this is really going right back to the start of the food chain, where we check the food safety, the official controls for meat, dairy and wine. I have to say that I seem to spend an awful lot more of my time doing checks on meat than I do on wine, but I suppose that's reasonable because meat is really about safety, whereas wine is mostly about authenticity. I have learnt a few important little facts. So one is that you're not allowed to sell Prosecco on tap. Or rather, if you see Prosecco on tap, it almost certainly isn't Prosecco. But maybe you don't go to those kinds of parties. But there's also, authenticity is a real issue in the wine trade. But with meat, it's absolutely about core food safety. And so FSA has vets and meat hygiene inspectors every single day in around 270 slaughterhouses, and we do audits and unannounced inspections in another 1,500 cutting plants, meat packing factories, game handling and so on. Overall, we check over 23 million animals every single year. And having been for the first time, having started this job into some of these abattoirs, I am so impressed at the work that goes on. So it starts right at the very beginning when the animals arrive, where our vets inspect them, and they're really looking out for animal welfare issues at that point. And any breaches of animal welfare are then reported back, they're tracked back to the farm and so on. And then they follow that carcass right the way through and are able to look for all of those signs of disease in a forensic way. It's an extraordinary skill which goes into ensuring that our food is safe. Now, of course, sometimes things go wrong, and that brings me to our incidents function. So typically we respond to about 2,500 food incidents every year. I was quite shocked when I heard how high it was. Some of them are very small scale. Occasionally it might be a cake has been labelled as having strawberry flavour and actually it was raspberry, and they're relatively inconsequential. But sometimes, of course, they're very serious. They may be about mislabelling, it may be about allergens, or it may be a food safety incident. So post-EU exit, this has got quite a bit more difficult as handling food incidents because we're no longer part of the EU schemes, which used to alert us if there was an incident in Greece or Spain. We would hear about it very, very quickly. So what we've had to do is to set up all of our own systems in order to be able to tell us when there's trouble afoot. So we now scan for incidents using global open source data to identify the signals, and then really can ensure, once again, that our sampling is intelligence-led. So we're looking in places where we have reason to suspect there may be a problem. We just can't rely just on random sampling. Now, whole genome sequencing, I think, is really helping to make a big, big difference in this area. Because what we're able to do is to identify and then differentiate between different bacterial and viral strains, so we can much more quickly identify the source of an outbreak and obviously bring it under control. And that is at a level that we were just unable to do previously, and we work very closely with UK HSA on doing this. I think one of the examples that I'm really proud of was around about this time last year, when there was a series of cases of salmonella, predominantly in relatively young children. And they were around the country. And as public health people will know, there's a system for tracking what people have eaten to try to identify the source. And unsurprisingly, when you looked what these children were eating, the two most common things were chicken and chocolate. So of course, everybody thought it was the chicken. So there was a lot of work done to try, but actually all the chickens were coming from different places. So then attention turned to the chocolate. And what we were able to do in the FSA was actually to trace this back to identify that the source was in a factory in Belgium. One of their vats of buttermilk was contaminated. We were able to show that this was an outbreak which was actually affecting across Europe, and we were able to announce a product recall of the Kinder Surprise just before Easter, which you can imagine led to some, well, you imagine some of the headlines. But it's impossible to know how many cases we averted. That's always the case with prevention. But nonetheless, I think that was a really important bit of sort of, forensic public health to stop what could have been quite a serious outbreak. When I'm asked what worries me most as being chair of the FSA, my immediate response, of course, is that it's a major food incident. And less than a decade ago, we faced the horse meat crisis when horse DNA was found in meat products. In some cases, as much as 100% of the whole product was horse, although often much, much lower than that. Now, this wasn't a food safety issue per se, but it was an issue of authenticity, and it significantly impacted on consumers' confidence that the food they eat is what it says it is. And so what we have really had to put in place since then is much, much better systems for checking speciation of meat, of traceability of the food supply. Because if you can't exactly trace what's coming from where, you don't know what else is in there. So, for example, there may be veterinary residues that are in, which you didn't know about. And this, we're now 10 years on, there's been quite a lot of coverage of horse meat, and many people have said that that there's a risk this will happen again. There is a risk. There is always a risk. We have to live with that risk. But in the FSA, we have to manage it as best we can. And what we have done is to substantially increase the resources that we put into our National Food Crime Unit, which is much, much better resource than it was previously. What we now have is, just to give you an example, in 2021, we had about 21 live investigations underway, whereas we've now got 89 strands of operation activity. I don't think that's necessarily that there's more crime per se, but I think we are much better at seeking it out. We're not only bringing offenders to court and getting them prosecuted, but more importantly, we're working with businesses to actually protect themselves from food crime. We had our first successful end-to-end prosecution, Interestingly, I don't know if John saw this in the press, was somebody who was convicted for selling 2,4-dinitrophenol. So this is basically a fertilizer byproduct. It was very, very briefly licensed in the US as a weight loss medication years and years ago, decades ago. But it is still being sold on the internet as a weight loss aid, and it kills people. And we have a consistent piece of work now in trying to take these websites down and to prosecute the people who continue to supply this. One of the things, here's another example. I mean, this was some of the food crime thing. This was a prosecution for a man who was running a meat cutting plant from his car wash. And the officers who went to this basically said it was one of the most unhygienic places that they'd ever set foot in. Now, one of my worries is that with the cost of living crisis, the rise in food prices, is that there is a very real and present danger of food crime, of serious organised criminals looking to exploit food because meat has become an expensive commodity, and of hard-pressed consumers who are looking to find cheaper ways of sourcing their food. So the cost of living crisis concerns us considerably in the FSA, and it's worrying both at a sort of personal and at a societal level. Back last summer, more than 3/4 of people were reporting being concerned about the price of food, and in particular worried about the cost of healthy food. We started a consumer tracker, which we've increased the frequency of. So now every month we survey consumers about their feelings and their worries in relation to food. And what we're seeing is that people are beginning to change their food-related behaviours in ways which may well put them at increased risk. So as you can see here, we have people who are turning their fridge down or turning their fridge off, or not cooking food properly, or not reheating it adequately. And all of these things are worrying because they could so easily turn into a food safety problem. What we're trying to do in our standing up for consumers is to make sure that this information is being put in front of policymakers so they understand the lengths that people are going to. But what we're also doing is trying to tailor our consumer information and support so that people do things which make sense and which genuinely save them money but don't put them at risk. So, for example, been working with the energy companies to make sure that they are telling people that turning off your fridge actually isn't going to be the best way to save energy, because you use up energy when you turn it back on again and have to chill it down. So at the moment we're in a position where about 30% of people are saying they can't afford to eat a healthy, balanced diet, and as this audience will well know, that that lack of access or affordability of healthy food is storing up that other problem of which I often talk about, which is obesity. We all know you can feed a child all the calories they need in a 30p pack of biscuits, but it's not going to fill them up, and the temptation to give them another pack of biscuits will be very high, and there leads the road to obesity. It's tremendously harmful for health, and I really am concerned that the lengths that people are going to is going to put their long-term health at risk. So let me just say a few words about a healthier diet. And as I said at the beginning, in England, responsibility for nutrition does sit with the Department of Health, but we advise ministers in Northern Ireland, and we advise the Welsh Government on compositional standards and labelling. But I'm going to allow myself just to slip into a little bit of FSA history for you, because it's obviously something that's close to my academic heart. So back in 2005, it was the FSA who introduced the UK's voluntary salt reduction programme. And in the first decade of that scheme, salt intakes in the UK came down by about 15%. And that was almost entirely due to reformulation on the part of industry. Sadly, since that time, intakes have basically stalled, and indeed progress on reformulation has slowed substantially, so that since about 2014 there's been no significant change, and possibly even a sign that salt intakes are going back up again, which is a real worry. Public Health England took over this programme from the FSA, and what they did was also to introduce a similar scheme, but this time for sugar, and there was also one for calorie reduction. Unlike salt, where we had targets which were in very fine categories, so ham was different from bread, was different from breakfast cereals, they all had their own target. PHE took a much more general approach, and they essentially said that there needed to be a 20% reduction in sugar in these top 10 categories which were providing sugar in the diet. And they gave industry, I think it was 5 or 6 years to achieve that. I'm afraid progress in that scheme has been, at best, rather mixed. We have seen a couple of categories which have done pretty well. So sugar content of breakfast cereals and yogurts have reduced quite substantially. I think that is good progress. They've not achieved the 20%, but they're at least, that looks like a decent effort. On the other hand, if you look at things like biscuits or cakes or particularly chocolate confectionery, there has been almost no progress at all. And that problem is made even worse. This is just the sales-weighted average sugar content, so how much sugar per 100 grams. But this problem is made even worse if we combine that with changes in sales. Because what's happened is that sales of confectionery have gone up. And so what we see is not a reduction in sugar from confectionery, but actually a substantial increase. And what's perhaps most disappointing is that the two categories which were doing well on reformulation, breakfast cereals and yogurts, are also ones where actually consumption of those products has declined. So I'm afraid we have got a very, very long way to go in relation to the salt reformulation programme. In contrast, there's been the soft drink industry levy. So this is a fiscal measure, it's a tax on the business. And what we've seen here is that this has prompted a massive change in industry behaviour. So there's been about a 29% reduction in the amount of sugar sold in soft drinks. And this is almost entirely attributable to reformulation. A tiny little bit of it is that consumers are buying different products. But I think what this slide really reminds me is it's a lot easier to change products than people. So if you think of all the publicity, all of the consumer awareness that sugary drinks are really not very good for your health, they're so not good for your health, we're going to put a tax on them. Yet still, we've got very, very little shift in consumer behaviour, and the change has been entirely driven by reformulation. Of course, this has led many people to say, well, this was mandatory and we should put a mandatory targets on these other foods. But of course, if you do that, you also have to have an enforcement mechanism. There has to be some way of ensuring that that happens. And I think that's pretty difficult to do. But what I think we have learned from the reformulation programmes is, again, that data is incredibly important in the system. If we want to hold companies to account, we need to be able to monitor what they're doing, and we need to be able to do that at a company level, not at a category level. Because if it's a category level, you can always rely on somebody else to do something. If it's at a company level, then your board has to be held to account. And I think we need to look again, much harder at the food system and how we can use data to really drive change. And I think that's something that in the FSA we feel very strongly about, that as we go forward, we will be able to regulate better if we make better use of data. So, just coming towards the end, I want to tell you about a couple of final areas which really are FSA areas and where I hope we might be able to contribute towards this healthier and more sustainable food system. And that's the work we do on regulated products. So we provide pre-market safety evaluation and advice. If people want to bring a new product to the market, that might be a new technology, so a GM product, for example, or it might be what we call a novel food, so a food that hasn't got a history of consumption in the UK. So something like insects might be considered as a novel food because they haven't traditionally been consumed. There may be novel ingredients, so things like CBD is very trendy at the moment and is considered a novel ingredient. We're just, previously this work was done by the European Food Standards Agency, and they did it for the whole of Europe. But now, post-Brexit, we have to do it all for ourselves. And so we're busy trying to gear up our capability and capacity to be able to take on this work. What it does mean, having left the EU, is that we do have a bit of an opportunity to do it differently, and this is one area where we're scoping out how we can make the system a bit more efficient and perhaps a little bit more proportionate. Because we want to bring foods which are genuinely going to make a positive difference, perhaps because they will help us to have a healthier diet. Maybe it's a novel way of producing food so you can have less salt, or maybe it's things like cell-cultured meat, for example, which might help us to reduce our meat consumption or at least make it a more sustainable part of our diet. These are all things which will have to be authorised for safety before they can be put on the market. I think novel proteins are probably one of the most exciting areas that are on at the moment, and this is everything from novel protein sources like microalgae or fermented or cultured products, right through to cell-cultured meat. And I had the opportunity to go and visit a company which has the largest pilot production site for cell-cultivated meat in the whole of Europe, a place called Ivy Farm. And the science is absolutely incredible. Tons of this is imported from regenerative medicine techniques of growing up cells in culture and then building 3D structures. Absolutely amazing. At the moment, none of this has been authorised for sale anywhere in Europe, certainly not in the UK. In fact, we haven't even received any applications for authorisations, but I think this is likely to start coming through pretty quickly. The other area where I think we're likely to see a change happening quite fast is in relation to gene editing, or so-called precision breeding. And some of you will be aware that a bill is going through the House, through Parliament at the moment, to essentially take gene editing out of the genetic modification rules and to provide so that it will make it easier for companies to use gene editing techniques to produce foods which are perhaps healthier, more sustainable, better for animal welfare, or a whole raft of other potential benefits. Within that, the FSA is responsible for creating the regulatory framework, because we absolutely want to support this innovation, but we also want to make sure it's safe. And making sure it's safe is absolutely vital for maintaining consumer confidence in food. Many of you will remember the worries that genetically modified food caused to many consumers. We haven't ever really recovered from that. So in creating a new regulatory framework, we want to maintain consumer confidence, and we also need to find a way of ensuring that consumers have the information they want so that they can make an informed choice. And that's quite a tricky thing to work out how we should do that. And if you're interested in that, there's a big item coming up on the next FSA board meeting, which, because we're very open and transparent, you can stream live to your computer and hear those discussions. The final thing we need to think about with precision breeding is, again, comes back to trade, because we need to ensure that there's good traceability in the system, so that if we want to export to countries that want to know whether they've got gene-edited components in their food, they'll be able to identify that. So that's quite enough. I haven't told you everything that we do in the FSA, you'll be pleased to hear, or you'd be here till midnight. But I hope what I've done is to give you a flavour of the breadth of the work that we do and how fundamental it is to protecting food safety and allowing people to have confidence in the food that they consume. There's huge changes happening in the food system. Some people will celebrate that, some people will fear it, but it's our job to actually do everything we can to maintain a food system that people can trust in this very uncertain and changing world. I'm hugely proud of the work that the FSA and all the staff do, and delighted that most people in our surveys say that they're confident that the food they buy is safe to eat. And I hope what I've been able to do tonight is to perhaps give you some of the tangible evidence of some of the work we're doing to make that happen. Because food safety is not good luck, it's good management. We can't prevent every bad thing happening, but what we can do is minimise the risk. So I hope that you'll go away from here conscious of the complexity of keeping food safe, but also feeling that there are many good reasons to trust that UK food continues to be some of the very safest in the world and produced to some of the highest standards in the world. Thank you.